This is an overview video for the 10th topic in the course on Introduction to Language Documentation and Description, this one on decolonizing language documentation. Some of the main ideas are that language documentation can even unintentionally perpetuate a colonial legacy of inequality in the world, that there are specific rhetoric and actions that are fairly common among language documentation practitioners, which can reinforce these inequalities rather than work against them, but that a long-term solution, a resolution to these inequalities is a long-term process, not a checklist of do's and don'ts or a single project that needs to be completed in the short term. These are the readings for this week's class. The Leonard 2018 is the initial required reading for the course. First readings by Hill in 2002 on expert rhetoric. This paper by Hill questions the impact of much of the rhetoric around language endangerment and language documentation that may be well-intentioned, but that does often not match the views of speakers of minoritized languages, and some rhetoric could unintentionally turn out to be harmful. Three rhetorical themes are critiqued. The first, universal ownership, is the idea that linguistic diversity is part of a world heritage that we all share. The danger is that this logic undermines the exclusive sense of ownership that many people have of their own language. Hyperbolic valorization is the rhetoric of speaking about languages as valuable resources or priceless treasures. This rhetoric seems to commodify languages and perpetuate the perception that skilled linguists are trading languages on the academic market for their own gain. Enumeration is the idea that languages are discrete entities that can be counted, and that the number of speakers of each language can be numbered. Besides being an oversimplification of the linguistic facts, this rhetoric may conflict with actual views and language use in many speech communities. In introducing the three themes, Hill writes, "Three of the themes that are ubiquitous in expert rhetoric may inadvertently undermine its goals of advocacy. These themes are compelling for members of dominant language communities, among whom experts propagandize for political and financial support. But they may have unfortunate entailments that go unnoticed by linguists and their target audiences of policymakers and funding agencies, yet distress and alienate speakers and members of their communities and amplify their distrust of linguists." The next paper is by Leonard, in the 2018 issue of Language Documentation and Conservation. Leonard is a linguist and a language documenter who is also a member of the Miami tribe of Oklahoma. In this paper, he shares his views on language documentation from his own perspective. Since language shift in the North American context is a result of social marginalization of the kind Leonard associates with colonialism, anyone from such a language group would find it odd to disassociate the linguistic facts from the historical and social context. Not only that, but the field of linguistics itself emerges from colonial context of Europeans studying the other. Even in the most current work in language documentation, projects are centered around the norms and values of Western academic institutions and are not designed to align with or recognize local approaches to using and documenting language. Leonard discusses several features of a decolonial approach to linguistics. One example is that decolonialized linguistics recognizes the social, cultural, political, and historical context of the language and the research project. This can lead to recognizing local values that are not necessarily expressed in Western academic circles, such as the Miami tribe's view that their language has an intrinsic relationship with the land. Decolonialized linguistics is based on relationships of reciprocity, respecting the responsibility that comes with knowledge and its dissemination, and actively engaging with community needs and institutions at all stages of the research process. Those relationships imply that the linguist actively engages with community needs and institutions. Some practical advice for how to advance towards these goals include more ethnographic research and the explicit acknowledgement of self-location, or recognizing the positionality of one's own background and the context driving the research project. Leonard writes, "Decolonialism disrupts the ideas and institutions of colonialism. It is a way of thinking and acting that emphasizes the sovereignty, peoplehood, intellectual traditions, and cultural values of groups that experience colonialism. Decolonial approaches in general look not just at a current situation, but also at the histories of institutions and power that have fostered it." Here's another quote from Leonard emphasizing the danger of hypocrisy in this area. "Colonialism is bad, and decolonial interventions are thus appropriate. I have encountered only a few scholars who state otherwise, usually under the guise of promoting objective science. The more common, and more troubling, are the problematic statements I have heard from language documentation practitioners who claim to support social justice, but whose actions suggest otherwise." The next reading is another article from the same 2018 Language Documentation and Conservation publication. Sawaki and Arka are Indonesian linguists coming from Papua and Bali. Both are heavily involved in language documentation projects. Their paper starts with a brief overview of linguistic diversity in eastern Indonesia. The authors then explore some of the reasons why most linguistic work in Indonesia has been led and funded by foreigners, and point to a combination of factors that make it very difficult for Indonesian linguists to compete for grants at an international level. They also point to the need for continued linguistic training that is less theoretical and more contextualized, focusing on practical outcomes for local language projects. Finally, they point to a very practical consideration: the use of the Indonesian term proyek, roughly meaning project, should not be used in the context of language documentation work, because this term is associated with well-funded development projects and can create expectations of freely distributed cash to anyone who participates in the project. In arguing for the need for more Indonesian linguists leading documentation projects in Indonesia, Sawaki and Arka write, "Ideally, language documentation should be led and performed by Indonesian linguists, for at least two reasons. First, employing Indonesian linguists promotes sustainability of the documentation. Typically living in or near the communities, local linguists can closely interact with and supervise community members in their documentation efforts. If linguists are locals, they also usually possess greater sociocultural knowledge, expertise, and skills than foreign linguists. Second, financially, employing locals would be more cost-effective than employing foreigners, and the money saved could be allocated for local needs." The next paper is a very recent conference presentation by Stephen Bird. Bird's recent conference paper discusses ways in which digital technology employed by linguists in the aim of saving languages can ironically end up leaving languages more endangered. Despite all of the progress in the field of language documentation in the past 20 years, there is little evidence that language endangerment has slowed down. In addition, there may be some side effects of our technological approaches to language documentation. Digitizing speech for linguistic analysis can have the effect of disenfranchising speakers from their language. The emphasis on data and archiving can privilege high-quality data over a record of how a language is actually used in natural contexts. And the fact that written versions of language are easier to analyze than audio can lead to a devaluation of oral language. Bird gives many suggestions on how linguists can take a decolonialized approach to working with speech communities. One general point is the need to recognize the post-colonial context that drives language endangerment. Bird also stresses the importance of building working relationships of mutual trust and respect. Other suggestions include a closer examination of the functions of language, a recognition of local agency in language use, over talking about linguists coming to save languages, and prioritizing knowledge transmission over language maintenance and providing support to oral learners of the language. The last paper is a manuscript from Gerald Roche. Roche writes about language documentation from the perspective of linguistic justice. The language endangerment that motivates language documentation is primarily due to unjust coercion. Roche does give two examples of language shift that could be considered a free choice, not coerced. That is, Swedish speakers in Finland choosing to learn Finnish and multilingualism in Melanesia. However, normally language shift can be seen as the result of an injustice, either an injustice of distribution of resources or of recognition. These social descriptions can equally be applied to languages. There is massive inequality in how many resources are associated with a few languages compared to most languages in the world. And there are issues of failing to recognize the authenticity and legitimacy of certain languages all over the world. Intervening for linguistic justice, therefore, requires economic intervention, as well as affirmation and recognition of all languages. This intervention must have an epistemic component, changing the way people think, a social component, changing the way people relate to each other, and a political component, changing the institutions and policies that perpetuate linguistic injustice. Roche views language projects like language documentation as vital but insufficient. He writes, "At present, our interventions resemble charity more than justice, insofar as they are matters of discretion rather than obligation, based on the goodwill of project designers, funders, and implementers, rather than the inalienable rights of the community. Without radical change, language oppression will continue, no matter how many projects we undertake."